a project that we titled A Data-Driven Analysis of Transportation Infrastructure Equity in Utah. So I had the privilege of being the principal investigator for this project. Our UDOT champion was Eileen Barron, and our staff support from UDOT was Brad Lovelace. And we had project staff from Avenue who assisted on this, including Colin Yee, Stacy Adams, Greg Sanchez, and Emma Abel. So getting into a huge thank you to our technical advisory committee. I obviously mentioned Eileen as our champion. She was instrumental in helping us weave through the sometimes difficult waters of discussing equity and making sure that we're addressing everything we need to without, pushing any of the wrong buttons or saying any of the wrong things, because we want this to be valuable. And it's so tricky in the environments that we have today to make sure that we're saying that, that we can make something useful without creating too many buzzwords or other issues that may sidestep from the issue at hand. So huge thank you to Eileen. Also, as I mentioned, Brad Lovelace, Lisa Zundel was fantastic at helping us, kind of lead this along. Alana Spendlove, Angelo was my constant helper in giving us all of the most up-to-date resources and things that we needed to make sure we didn't overlook. Angelo always has his finger to the pulse of what's going on with, it seems like, everything. And so I was very, very grateful to Angelo for making sure every meeting we had, he's like, did you know about this? Did you know about this? And he was just like, we couldn't have done this without him. He kept me on the straight and narrow and kept me pointed in the right direction with all of the existing resources, which also kept us firmly entrenched in the framework of UDOT's vision and mission and making sure that we were addressing the direction that the department wants to go. Stephanie Tomlin, huge help to us on GIS, helping us find the data sets that we needed to be able to do a good job and to include all the variables. And then Cristobal from UTA in making sure that we were answering the tough questions. For example, in some of our preliminary discussions, we hadn't even crossed the bridge of talking about historic redlining. And he brought that up, and it ended up being one of the most important components of the research project. So I can't say enough good things about this TAC. They were invested, they were, they participated heavily, and it was one of the best TACs that I've ever had the opportunity to work with at UDOT. So thank you to all of you for the time and energy and effort that you put in helping make this research what it was in the end, because we couldn't have done it, and I guarantee it would have ended up in a different place without all of you. So just to provide a general background on this project and kind of where it came from, UDOT's one of the main goals that we see within the department now is this concept of opportunity for all, where we're looking at this vision of creating equitable access for everyone, not just one specific group of people, not just one area, and not just one mode of transportation. We really want to look at the all users mindset and make sure that everyone has the opportunity to be able to use transportation, use the system, and have it meet their needs throughout the state. One thing that we noticed early on is that large projects are typically located in newer areas or areas with new development. Those are the areas with the higher rates of growth. Those are the areas where we see capacity improvement projects. So do we need to add lanes? Do we need to, do pavement projects? Are we adding, a new roadway in a greenfield development? And so those are the areas where we are seeing more, I don't want to say more investment, but that's where the major projects take place. That's where the, reinvestment, reinvigoration seems to be taking place, is in these areas where there is an additional substantial need, such as a capacity improvement. And so those are the areas where we're seeing, oh, well, if we're going to repave or if we're going to add capacity, we're going to add a bike lane, or we're going to add curb gutter sidewalk while we're already doing this project. What that means, though, is that these older built out areas in some of the older parts of our towns, some of the historic, 1950s, pre-1950s areas, they don't get a lot of this investment because they don't have the need for the capacity projects. They don't have a ton of new people moving in. They've had a pretty steady population for a very long time. And so they're not seeing these same types of, we're not adding lanes, so we're not adding bike lanes. We're not going in and putting in curb gutter sidewalk. We're not adding some of those additional amenities or projects that we see in some of these other areas. You couple that with the idea that a lot of these communities that may have the greatest need for some of these things also have the fewest resources to provide matching funds. One of the examples that Travis Evans gave me several years ago when we were discussing Safe Routes to School was an example from Wendover. In Wendover, they had a Safe Routes to School sidewalk project that they wanted to put in. They had a strong need to be able to fill this gap for kids to be able to walk to school safely. It took the city 7 years to be able to save up enough money to provide the matching funds for the Safe Routes to School grant. And so you can see that, I mean, it seems like, oh, it's a grant, it's free money. But we also have to remember that these communities have to have skin in the game and they have to provide those matching funds. And some of these areas that have the highest level of need also have the least ability to be able to provide that funding or to be able to provide those finances for the matching funds. You know, some of the bigger cities might say it's a sidewalk. You know, if we only have to put down 20% of this section of sidewalk, that's nothing in comparison to our budget. But for a lot of our older, smaller towns that, you know, they don't have building permit income coming in, they may not have a whole lot of sales tax, their budgets are very tight. And so coming up with those matching funds can be very difficult. And that goes for all of our funding, right? We have TAP funds, we have CMAQ, we have all of these funds that the cities can access, but there's always a matching component that goes along with that. So the idea behind this project, as I was talking to Eileen, you know, several years ago now, was that we wanted to really focus on what WFRC had identified as these equity focus areas. And they had identified these areas that had a high level of need based on the demographics, household characteristics, etc. And within those equity focus areas, or those areas that we recognized as having a higher need, or, you know, a greater need based on the demographics, we wanted to be able to evaluate the infrastructure in those areas. So let's take a low income, you know, high percentage minority neighborhood, and what do the amenities and what does the infrastructure look like there? Do we see lower pavement quality? Do we see, you know, a lack of reinvestment, or fewer bike lanes, fewer sidewalks, all of those kinds of things? We wanted to really be able to look at the demographics alongside the infrastructure. And then to be able to conduct a spatial analysis to identify if some of these areas that may have a greater need are experiencing significantly less investment, or if there's kind of a mismatch, if you will, in terms of the investment and the projects that they're getting and the quality of their environment versus the demographics of the area. Because as we all know, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but a lot of these areas, they can be single vehicle households or no vehicle households where, you know, they're reliant on walking and biking or transit to get where they need to go. And if we don't have sidewalks, and if we don't have bike lanes, and if we don't have good transit access, then that is not providing for all users. And that is not, you know, a transportation system that meets the needs of everyone. So we wanted to be able to examine some systemic approaches of how we could create more equity across the system based on the needs that we were able to identify. So to give you a better idea of these WFRC focus, equity focus areas, they include census tracts with greater than 25% of the households that are low income. And then I put some highlights from the research in here. So low income populations typically have less access to reliable transportation. They have economic limitations that may impact their mobility. Greater than 40% persons of color. So we know that ethnic minority populations can sometimes have disparate impacts of their communities. You know, there have been a ton of research studies showing the differences between minority communities and predominantly, you know, Caucasian communities and things like that. So we wanted to look at that. And then the last criteria was greater than 10% no vehicle households, because as I mentioned before, you know, these are people that are reliant on transit, walking, biking, etc., to get not only to, you know, their regular destinations, but employment, healthcare, etc. And so some of these critical destinations. The data sets that we used for this analysis process included looking at the infrastructure that is present. We use data sets including UDOT projects. So this was what projects have been done over the last, you know, 10 years within the department. The quality of the signage. There's actually a signs database that will tell us, are the signs in good condition? Are they in bad condition? You know, are they in a rural area where people are doing shotgun practice on the signs? We know that happens. You know, when we have bad windstorms, sometimes they blow over. And so this signs database was very, very helpful in letting us know, are the signs up to, are they good quality? Are they the appropriate signage for the area? The presence of rumble strips. What does the intersection configuration look like? Pavement striping, do we have dedicated left turn lanes? Are there turn arrows, right turn arrows, etc.? Driveways in the asset database, we looked at, access management. How many driveways are there? We know that driveways closer to intersections actually impact safety for pedestrians and cyclists. When you have a lot of people coming in and out, especially near a complex system like an intersection, it can really impact safety for those non-motorists. Presence of bike lanes, the presence of shoulders. So are we looking at travel lanes that don't give you that buffer between the side? Presence of medians. So not only pedestrian refuge type medians, but just a center median, a concrete median that prevents left turns, etc. Poor sign condition. That was one that we kind of flagged for areas where there hasn't been a lot of upkeep or maintenance on the signage. And then, as I mentioned earlier, those EPM projects saying, did we do a resurfacing project? Because we could pull all of that information from EPM. Then we pulled in the transit. So we looked at UTA routes, ridership levels. So where are our census tracts that we have the highest, which stops have the highest transit ridership? Because that gives us a very good surrogate for areas where we may be more reliant or captive to transit use. So we like to look at that. Then demographics, obviously we used race and ethnicity, poverty and income, age by language spoken at home. So do we have a younger population that's predominantly, a language other than English spoken at home, or do we have elderly with a language other than English spoken at home? Because that can be very difficult. Sex by educational attainment. So looking at male and female, do we have, lower educated population versus college educated or higher education? The Utah Social Vulnerability Index, which we're going to talk about again in a minute. The disadvantaged tracts from the WFRC index. And then we pulled out redlining. Keep in mind, we were only able to look at Salt Lake and Ogden from the redlining data set because the majority of the rest of the state was very rural when redlining was taking place. And so we didn't necessarily have historic redlining in St. George or in some of those other locations. But you'll see the Salt Lake and Ogden urban areas in those redlining data sets. So our data collection sources, you can see kind of where we were able to compile the data from. I'm just going to gloss over this. All of you are very familiar with where this data comes from. Our demographic data came from the census, from WFRC, some other current projects where our company had been pulling demographic data. We worked on the vulnerable road users project. And so we had a ton of data from that project that we were able to integrate. Also transportation infrastructure. We used the UDOT data portal, the UTA data portal, and then UGRC for a lot of the data. Historic data came from UGRC, and then Richmond University has a very substantial database looking at historic redlining. And so we were able to get our hands on that data set. And then some other data that we were able to pull in. As I mentioned, Stephanie was very valuable in helping us identify where we might be able to find variables in different data sets. Sometimes the variable you need isn't in the most obvious data set. And so she was able to kind of help us sleuth our way through some of the UDOT data to find the things that we needed. In addition, we also had some direct communication, just saying, hey, is this data available? Some of it we got in an Excel sheet and we were able to code that into the GIS database. And then WFRC maintains a pretty large database of different data sets and information. Most of you know how this works, but for our analysis, we imported each layer of data into a spatially referenced database for statistical evaluation. So you can see we had our census tracts each identified, and then we pulled in our demographics. So you have your percent poverty, your percent non-English speaking, pavement projects in the last 5 years, areas with poor signage. And so we were able to layer all of these over top of each other and see where we had those hot spots, if you will, pop up, where a lot of these red flag variables seemed to cluster on top of one another. Some of the analysis methods that we used, I'm not going to go into a great bit of detail because I'll probably put everyone to sleep, but we used some minimum least squares regressions where basically that's if we increase X by 1 unit, what happens to Y? Our binary logistic regression is if we have X present, what is the probability of Y being present? So that's more of a probability statement. Then we used multinomial logistics. So if we have X present, what's the probability of each value of Y? So this is if you have different categories for a Y. So different types of vehicles or different age groups or things like that. And then we used a latent class cluster analysis, which looks at the overall data and says, out of this huge data set, which variables tend to cluster together? So if we see low income, do we also see higher percentage minority? Do we also see, lower environmental quality variables? And so we were able to do some cluster analysis to really help us identify, because sometimes we can look at patterns and we think we see what's going on, but when you let the computer really dive in and do that analysis, it'll pull out things that we can't necessarily kind of see at face value. The process, obviously, all of the data was collected and compiled into a single database. And then we looked at all of those data sets that we were provided. We looked at the quality, where gaps might be present in infrastructure, and then we performed a statistical analysis, as I mentioned on the last slide, and we used ArcGIS Pro to help visualize the analysis. So we'll be showing you some maps today about how some of those analyses panned out when we were able to look deeper. So to give you I'll give you the preliminary results, and then we're going to dive into each of these a little bit below the surface level. So when we started with the WFRC equity focus areas, what we found is that more than 25% of these areas were low income. So we had a large number, over 40% persons of color, again, over 10% zero car households. 16 census tracts in the entire state of Utah meet those criteria. That's only 2%. And so when we found this, we went back to the TAC and said, we can continue analyzing the data based on this 2% of census tracts, but that's going to be a very, very narrow focus. What about some of these other tracts that are close or maybe have other demographic issues that we're not seeing? Because that is a pretty specific definition. And obviously those are areas we really want to focus on. But what about some of the other areas that might not come to mind initially? And so what we did is we first ran the statistics on these focus areas. And what we found is that there were actually more bike lanes and sidewalks in these areas. And we'll talk about why that's the case. But to give you kind of the teaser, it's a lot of these are located along busier roads and major arterials. And where do we see our improvement projects for capacity? Along major arterials. And so if you have these lower income census tracts are located right on Redwood Road or right on Washington Boulevard, or, some of these areas where, yeah, they've done a lot of work to put in bike lanes and sidewalks and make them nice, but there are additional impacts right off of those corridors for these lower income neighborhoods or these higher risk neighborhoods. We see higher transit ridership in these areas, which, a lot of this seems a little bit common sense, but it's good to confirm with the numbers what we're actually seeing. The speed limit and the number of lanes were higher in these census tracts. So you've got more major arterials, more high capacity roadways, faster moving vehicles, things like that. There actually are more trails and paths through these areas because, again, we're typically paralleling areas with these arterials. I mean, you think of the Jordan River Parkway. How far away is the Jordan River Parkway from major arterials? Pretty close, right? It parallels so you may have a major trail right next to you, but you're also going to have a major arterial right there, similar to, the DNRG trail or some of the trails, the Legacy Highway Trail. Yeah, you've got a trail, but you've also got I-15, so there are these other kind of the locations where we've been putting trails and pathways are very close by because we're trying to get the bikes and the peds off of these major arterials onto a dedicated grade separated facility. And so that's where we see this correlation. And then we also saw that in these areas, we typically will see signage that's in fair or poor condition. So we're not replacing a lot of signs. They're, maybe a little bit more aged, a little more worn out. Maybe we have signs missing or that, haven't been replaced in these areas. So what we did next is we said, how can we branch out from those WFRC focus areas to look at some additional variables? So what we pulled is, as I mentioned earlier, we had worked on the vulnerable road users assessment for the state of Utah. And part of that looked at the CDC's social vulnerability index. And what that SVI index does is it looks at these variables that are listed over to the right. It includes socioeconomic status. So you've got, again, that low income below the poverty level, unemployed, housing cost burden. So these are people that the majority of their income is going to pay towards their housing. no high school diploma, no health insurance, those types of socioeconomic conditions. Then we have household characteristics. So these are the very old, the very young, potentially households where there's a disability, single parent homes, and a lack of English language proficiency. So languages other than English spoken in the home. Then we have that racial and ethnic minority status. So non-Caucasian households, predominantly looking at high percentages in that category. And then looking at housing type and transportation. These are, apartments, townhouses, multi-unit structures, areas where we have potentially mobile homes or crowding. There were a number of areas where we had, 2, 3+ households all sharing one housing unit. You've got multi-generational families sharing a housing unit. And so, somebody loses their job, sister moves in with her kids, and now all of a sudden we have, 18 people living in one household. No vehicle, group quarters, etc. So, roommate situations. A lot of these tend to be up near the universities where we have, non-related people living in the same household. You may be sharing a room with someone. You maybe, have a 3-bedroom house and there are 3 different people each renting one room. So to give you kind of a better idea, and we figured that the SVI index, which has been pilot tested and run through all of the rigors of CDC, National Institutes of Health for their examination of equity, we figured by using this, we might be able to branch out and get a larger sample to really evaluate throughout the state and not just focusing on those very, very high need areas, but, maybe give us a little bit more to work with. So what we found is, here's the map of those equity focus areas. In red are those equity focus areas identified that, those 16 census tracts that we talked about. This is where they're located. You see some in Ogden, near the traditional downtown area. Salt Lake City, I'm sure everybody, if I would have given you a blank map, you probably could have identified some of these on your own. And then some near southeastern Utah, down, that Kanab, Lake Powell area of the state. We have reservations down there. We have a typically more low income population. So you can kind of see where that pans out. Historic redlining in these areas, because I mentioned redlining was going to be a big deal. So which of these census tracts, you can see the yellow ones are the equity focus areas. The ones that are red also had historic redlining. And you see how well those line up, and it pops out pretty quickly of historic redlining lines up pretty closely, except for further south in the valley where it developed a little bit later, and then down in that southeastern portion of the state where there was no historic redlining. Then we expanded, as I said, to those social vulnerability index tracts, and that gave us 152 tracts, which then we're looking at about 20% of the tracts in the state. So we're getting a much larger picture of where we might have need or where investment may be beneficial. And so we were able to dive in there, and you can see these tracts encompass a larger area, and some that you may not typically think of. We've got, eastern Utah, you're looking at Vernal, Green River, some of those areas, Moab, out in the east. Then you get down further south, and again, you see that southeastern corner, but there's also some areas closer to St. George, that central area of the state, and then out towards Tooele County, which is a big one, out as we get towards Wendover, and some of those very small communities out towards the west. If we overlay that with historic redlining, again, look what pops out. You've got Ogden and Salt Lake. Again, that's where we have the data for, because that's where the redlining took place. But look at how those tracts overlap. It's very easy to see that historic redlining was correlated to current equity conditions. And we'll talk about that more as we kind of move into our recommendations. So this table, I know that the numbers are very small. The gray lines are the ones that popped up as significant, and that's why I pulled all of that out. The final report is available if you really want to dig into the numbers and see these up close. But what you can see is in those high SVI tracts where those values were very high, redlining was more prevalent, and all of these are statistically significant. So when we ran the data analysis, we saw redlining. There are more schools, both higher education schools and K through 12 schools, which we'll discuss. Because some of these, when we first saw the results, we kind of had to sit back and go, okay, why would that be the case? As with any research, some of the findings don't always make sense up front. But as we really dove in and started looking at more literature and pulling things out, you'll start to see why this is the case. More signalized intersections. Again, higher volume roads tend to have signals, not stop signs. More safety comments. We pulled a database from UDOT looking at submitted safety issues. When people call up and say, hey, there's an intersection or there's an area near my home that's not safe, they catalog those and they geocode them, and we were able to pull them in. And these high SVI areas had more complaints about safety issues than the rest of the state, if you will. There are more EPM projects conducted again. So we're seeing capacity projects, we're seeing investment, we're seeing, UDOT is not ignoring these areas. There's actually quite a lot of projects happening in these areas. There's more signal maintenance, which likely means we're out there, we're invested, we're trying to get traffic to move more smoothly. We're trying to, maximize capacity, maximize movement, reduce delay, all of those good engineering things. But, then we have to think about the unintended consequences of those on the surrounding communities. More roads with bike lanes. We discussed that earlier. Higher average number of roadway lanes. We've also talked about that. And more pavement messages, which pavement messages kind of go along with complex intersections. If you have an intersection that's one lane each direction, not very complicated. We don't typically need to see pavement messaging. When you have a more complex intersection where you have 2 lanes going through, 2 left turn lanes, 1 dedicated right, then you're going to see more pavement messaging saying, left turn only, right turn only, through lanes, etc. And so in these areas, we see a lot more pavement messaging, which shows us that these are more complex intersections. They're near those, higher volume, high capacity areas where we're moving a lot of cars. The built environment scoring. So the next step beyond looking at those social vulnerability index, all of that good demographic and population information, we had to go in and say, okay, well, what about the environment? How are we going to code this? Like, how do we know what environmental variables are important? And so what we did is we identified, based on what had been popping up as significant, we said, okay, let's give it a score and find out where these exist. So presence of redlining was yes or no. If there was historic redlining, it received 1 point. Each of these categories received 1 point. Number of K through 12 schools, if it was less than 1.5, we gave it a point. Higher education, if it was more than 0.1 school per area, it received a point. Because you have to remember, these tracts are very small. And so you'll get 10 tracts around like one university. And then, so that would give you the 1. So that's where the fraction comes in. Percent of signalized intersections. So if it was more than 30% of the intersections in this area were signalized, they received a point. If they had more than 4 lanes on average for their roadways, that received a point. Number of safety comments, if they had more than about 1/2 of a safety comment per tract, because if you think about a census tract, the population is about 100 homes per tract. And so if you're getting, that's like 1 comment for every 200 households. And so when you start multiplying that out, it ends up equalizing to a lot of comments. So you can see, these seem relatively low, like only a 1/2 of a comment, but when you multiply it out, it actually is pretty significant. Signal maintenance, if there were more than 2 instances of signal maintenance within the last year, it received a point. And then those pavement messages, if there were more than 70 pavement messages within the tract on roadways, that was kind of the cutoff where we saw that significant increase. And then pavement quality, if the percentage of pavement within the tract, if over 50% of the pavement was rated as fair or poor, then that received a point. So the total scoring for this, as you can see, was out of, I think it's 9 points. It's been a bit. Yeah, 9 points total scoring. So built environment, you could get 9 points, and that was like flashing red lights. This is an area that has all of these things. This is a big problem. And then the tracts scoring 4 or more points, out of the 716 tracts that we looked at for high SVI, 252 also had high values for those built environment variables. And so we overlaid those in the map, and this is what we saw. So you can see all of the census tracts that are shown in here. This is statewide, not including those SVIs, but this is just their built environment scores based on that last slide that I described. So if they had all 9 of them, they're that dark, dark red. I think we only had 1 that had 9, and it was in Salt Lake City, up on the bench by the university. Then you can see As it goes towards yellow, that's fewer built environment concerns. But in most of the urbanized areas, you see that there are tracts with, 4 or more of these concerns. So then we overlaid that with our SVI high value tracts. And if it's only high SVI, it's in orange. If it's only high for built environment, it's that pink, the kind of salmon pink. If it is high for both, so it has a vulnerable population and built environment concerns, those are in red. And so you can see the statewide map on the left, but then over to the right, that top left corner is the Salt Lake Valley. So you can see a lot of clustering near kind of the downtown Salt Lake west side down into West Valley, some a little bit further south, kind of pocketed. Then if you look into Utah County, which is that top right, you can see, Old Town, Provo, south of the mall, south of campus area, and then some out on that west side of Utah Lake. And then as you move down, we've got Ogden on the bottom left. Again, nothing super surprising there. And then we have down near St. George in that bottom right. So you can kind of get a picture of where those clustering areas are. And this, even this in and of itself would be hugely beneficial because it gives you an idea of, okay, where are these vulnerable tracts that also have built environment concerns? And we can identify exactly what those concerns might be. But then we went in and really dove into these significant variables. Why are these variables contributing? Because it's great to know that they are, but if you don't understand why they're significant, there's not really a good way to go about fixing the problem. And so we spent quite a bit of time on the tail end of this project, really diving in, doing some follow-up research to figure out why these variables are so significant. And we started with redlining. I mentioned this from the very beginning of the presentation, but you can see areas with historic redlining, we noticed a number of characteristics. These are areas that have typically smaller homes, smaller lots. They're closer to the historic central business district because if you think about transportation back in this time period, automobiles were still not super common. These are areas where, you maybe had one vehicle per household, typically husband working outside the home, wife at home, except for in rare circumstances. It was a different time period transportation wise. And so people had to live closer. They were reliant on transit, etc. And so we see these areas kind of west side of Salt Lake City. If you look at, Glendale, Rose Park, some of those neighborhoods that were the earliest neighborhoods up in the, Marmalade District, some of those neighborhoods that were the early suburbs of downtown Salt Lake City. They're less expensive older homes. And so who moves into less expensive older homes? People that can't afford bigger, newer homes, right? And so you've got that lower income. These areas typically are less susceptible to gentrification because even though they're close to downtown, unless a developer comes in and buys up all of them, they're not really going to see that turnover that we've seen in Sugar House and Mill Creek and some of those other areas. Some of these homes, because they're on smaller lots, there's not as much room for larger families. And so if you have a larger family, where are you going to move? You're going to move out to the suburbs if you can afford it. If you can't afford it, you're going to stay there and you're going to live in the smaller houses. They don't tend to turn over and they don't tend to have, these homes aren't reinvested in because a lot of the families and the households that live there don't have the disposable income to redo the siding on the outside of the house or replace the roof or landscape and make it pretty. There are exceptions, obviously, to every rule. There are some beautiful homes in these areas. But for the most part, a single mom who is working 2 jobs to support her kids isn't going to be concerned that the front door needs to be painted. And so you just don't see that investment in the properties that you get in other areas. And there's a lack of amenities. We don't see the investment in those amenities because you don't have the disposable income for businesses and things like that to go into these areas because they won't stay in business. They don't have the market base. Presence of schools. This was something that was really interesting. In the SVI, high SVI index areas, what we saw is fewer K through 12 schools. Now you might think, well, lower income people, they still have kids. Where are their kids going to school? But what we've seen in the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years in a lot of these areas, Ogden and Salt Lake particularly, is that we're seeing this suburban flight where younger families with kids they want to be out in the suburbs where they have more bedrooms, where they have larger yards, they have parks. There may be the tendency to feel in like they're in a safer area. They may have access to better schools, if you will, for better or worse. And so a lot of the households with larger families are moving further away from downtown if they have the means to do so. What that means, we've also seen since COVID an increase in homeschool families, where people just didn't send their kids back. They liked the flexibility. In lower income families, we saw a lot of kids didn't go back and dropped out of school after COVID because they got in the habit of staying home every day. Why go back? Which is terribly unfortunate. But then what we see is Salt Lake City District starts announcing that we just don't have enough kids. All the families with kids are moving. We can't support a local school, so we're going to close the school. And so you can see in this news article that I pulled up there, Salt Lake School District recommended closing 4 elementary schools. So for the kids that are still there, now they're getting bused outside their neighborhood to other schools. Granite High School, a staple of, the traditional historic downtown area, it was closed because there weren't enough students to maintain a student body for the school. Higher education institutions was kind of a flip side to this. We saw more higher education institutions. And I mentioned briefly earlier the student populations up around the universities where you have we consider them a more transient population. Sometimes they go home for the summer. They're not there. They're not invested in the community. They're not necessarily invested in their neighborhoods. You don't often see undergrad students out planting flowers and, beautifying the neighborhood. A lot of these kids are low income because they're either not employed while they're going to school or they're underemployed. They're working at Starbucks or at Jimmy John's or, they're making enough money for spending money, but then they're using student loans or, parents are paying tuition. And so they just don't have the kind of income that we would see in a more stable household area. And that means that these areas get classified as lower income, multiple family households, et cetera, that tend to get flagged in those SVI areas. The housing stock is older. And again, there's not the investment because if you own one of these homes by the university, are you going to fix it up if you're renting it out to college students? Probably not. I mean, you'll keep it in working order, but they throw a party and trash the place. You're not going to care about reinvesting and making it a beautiful, nice home that you would rent to, a family in the suburbs versus, transient students that come in for 9 months of the year. Also, there's not really investments in other amenities outside the university because the university provides rec center and they provide, sports and activities and areas for those. There's a library, there's those kinds of things. And so these areas around higher education institutions, and it's not just the University of Utah. We see this up near Weber State, down near Utah Tech in St. George, the areas around Salt Lake Community College. Because the university provides those amenities, we don't see the cities providing a lot of other amenities in the areas surrounding. Or they say, it's a student population. Why would we put in a park with a playground? There's some rationality that goes into that starts to really help it make more sense as you dig a little bit deeper into what these findings actually mean. Getting into signalized intersections and signal maintenance. We've talked about this a lot through this presentation. The higher percentage of intersections are signalized. They look like this, quite honestly. Here's Redwood Road. We have dedicated right turn lanes, dedicated left turn lanes. We've got center medians. It's a very complex intersection. And this is what we see near those high SVI tracts. They're major roadways, major arterials, like, major northwest or north, south, east, west corridors that we have a lot of VMT on. We also see more fatalities on these roadways. This is where we see clustering of active transportation, severe injuries, fatal crashes, because as a pedestrian, you're a lot more likely to get injured or killed crossing a roadway like this than you would be, a 25-mile-an-hour neighborhood street. So we see that within the data. More signal maintenance, because again, as I mentioned, we're focusing on vehicle movement. And so if we start to see delay, we'll send the signal timing crew out to fiddle with things. Let's create better movement. Let's retime the left turns. Let's create efficiency. And so there we see that trade-off between safety and mobility, where we got to move more cars. We can't have the delay, but then what about the people that live in that area that are captive to walking, biking, transit, etc. Larger number of lanes. This is University Avenue in Orem, next to one of our SVI tracks. I mean, this is first thing in the morning, and so we don't have a lot of traffic on it. I actually liked it because it just showed the sheer breadth of the roadway and how wide it is. But it's a major arterial. You can imagine at rush hour, this is jam-packed with people. You know, at this time of the morning, you probably could get across easily. But when this roadway is packed with people, suddenly it becomes a bigger issue, just like the last one that we showed. Additionally, when you have more lanes and you have more vehicles, that leads to a lot of other externalities that aren't always considered when we look at transportation equity. But one major takeaway that we found within this is, going back to the literature, these areas that have higher VMT, higher, more volume, more lanes, etc., we see air quality issues. The people that live within a certain proximity of these types of roadways end up with more pulmonary issues, asthma, breathing problems. Heart disease is higher because of the impacts that particulate pollution can have on your heart and on your arteries. Noise pollution is a huge one that we don't necessarily think about. If you live in an area where you kind of get used to that hum of traffic, you don't think about it anymore. But have you ever tried to sleep somewhere where you're not used to the traffic noise? It can have a huge impact on you. And it's not just a mental health thing, it's a physical health thing, because if you have that noise and you're not sleeping, then that impacts your physical health and has all those other externalities. So not only that, water quality, runoff, one thing we found is with pavement quality, 64% of the roads in these vulnerable areas have fair or poor pavement quality. These pictures are from the west side of Ogden, where they're probably fine. Nobody's going to complain. They're paved, kind of. It's more of a gravel situation at this point, but you can see, like, on the top one, there's a pothole in the middle. It shows winter time when you've probably had plows come through here to dig up that nice extra layer of gravel. But when you're in a situation like this, poor pavement quality impacts safety, and it also impacts vehicle performance. When you're drumming up all of that gravel underneath, you can get rocks that can crack things. It's funny, they just chip sealed a road near my neighborhood, and it popped up a really big piece of chip into one of my neighbor's old cars, cracked the radiator. So then they had a radiator leak that they had to go get repaired. And you don't think about things like that. I mean, you think, oh, look, we're doing a pavement improvement project, not dang, now all that gravel that was on the road, it chips windshields, it gets tossed up. And even when you do, something like this, where are you supposed to ride your bike when the shoulder is mud or gravel? Anybody who's ridden a bike on gravel can tell you how safe that is, and it's not even the cars that are the danger. It's a very real issue. And if you have little kids riding bikes, are they going to ride in the gravel? No, they're going to ride down the middle of the street. I have kids. They're very rational in the way that they do things, in the sense that, well, why would I ride in the gravel? I'll ride in the middle of the road. They don't have the safety piece of the rationality, but they definitely will maximize the efficiency. And so then in the bottom picture, there's another one, Reese Avenue. You can see there's no sidewalk on either side of that road until you get further down. The garbage cans are just kind of out in the roadway. It's very narrow. It's just, you can tell there hasn't been a lot of upkeep, but there's not a lot of traffic. And so why would the city worry about, oh, we need to go do a pavement project for these 7 houses on Reese Avenue? Because it's out of sight, out of mind. There haven't been, if there was a big hole in the road, they'd probably come fill the hole, but you just don't see the major investment in the major projects. And then you don't get those other pavement improvements. If they came and repaved this road, they might say, oh, well, maybe we should put in the curb gutter sidewalk or extend this while we're here, since we're already tearing everything up. And so they just don't get those kinds of things. To give you an idea of some of the data limitations within this study, obviously we did have some very significant results and we were able to glean a lot of information, but there is a lack of infrastructure in areas. We don't necessarily have shoulder information for every single roadway in the whole state. We don't have pavement messaging especially for local roads. We're very, very good at information for UDOT roads, but when it comes to local roads, if the locals go out and paint sharrows on a neighborhood street, we may not get that information. And so we just don't have a comprehensive statewide database. We're very good. Like I said, the high volume, high ADT roadways are typically UDOT roads. And so we have all of that information for those, but some of the city roads, we just don't necessarily have. And certain areas, again, may not warrant or need infrastructure. So even if you sent the city out there, they'd look at it and be like, it looks fine to us, And so just because it hasn't seen improvements for a long time doesn't necessarily mean that it needs the improvements, but it's worth investigating and actually going out to some of these areas and saying, hey, what do we need? Again, rural areas don't have as much infrastructure. They maybe have one main road that goes through the whole town, and a lot of the driveways are dirt roads or gravel roads, just because why would they pave their driveway? It's just not necessary. But they have less people too, and so they may not have the VMT on those roads. They may not have the need to really go in. I mean, in some of these areas, like, what would be the point of curb gutter sidewalk that would service 3 houses in 2 miles? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so it would be nice, like, yeah, if you could add shoulder so that there's at least a safe place for them to navigate. But, some of this, you have to kind of look at it contextually. UDOT data is state routes, as I mentioned, and then sidewalk data. As much as we really have been working hard on getting good sidewalk data, it's still incomplete. And we do not have a comprehensive sidewalk database for residential areas. Again, UDOT's done a great job of filling it in along state routes. And a lot of the cities, as they've done like active transportation plans and things, we've been able to piece it together. But they don't necessarily tell anyone when they go fill in the 200-foot gap of sidewalk. And so we just don't have 100% accurate sidewalk data. And again, it's mostly estimates. I mean, we can use Google Earth to try to go in and interpolate, but how old are those air photos, et cetera, et cetera. So we did, for this report, make a timeline, because I think understanding the historicity of the issue gives you a better idea. I mean, it's all context, right? When we talk, we have to start back at redlining and pre-redlining to look at how did we get where we are now, because that's how we got to where we are now. And Eileen and I talked a lot about this, but we created this graphic. Again, on the PowerPoint, it's a little bit fuzzy. It's very clear in the report, but you can see back in 1890, rapid transit begins in Salt Lake. We had our first 30 miles of track. Then you get to 1903 and we get Utah Light and Transit, and we expand to 80 miles of track. We're doing great on the transit. 1926, the funny thing, from 1914, we had 7,000 cars registered in the state. Get to 1926, we have 91,000 cars. So that's really that explosive time period where people started kind of jumping on. But again, these were recreational vehicles. It was like, let's go for a Sunday drive, not we're going to drive our cars everywhere we go for every activity. 1928, we got rubber tired buses for the first time. Then 1934, that's when redlining started. And so you can start to see how we had good transit. We had, things in place, and then redlining began. And then in 1937, the U.S. Housing Act was enacted that was a home for every American. You can see 49, we updated a decent home for every American. Everybody deserves a house. Then we got the VA loans, as our veterans were coming back. And then we see widespread suburbanization. In 1952, actually, the government started to recommend sidewalks in every neighborhood. Utah didn't start putting that into code until 1980s. The subdivisions that were built prior to about 1980, you don't see sidewalk ordinances. And that's where you get, Mill Creek and some of those older areas where there is no curb gutter sidewalk. The newer suburban areas have curb gutter sidewalk, but they're like the 4-foot sidewalks, because we still, we'll just put in what's required, the tiny little ones. I-15 construction began in 57, and we all know what happens when you build a new road or widen the road. If you build it, they will come. Then we start seeing people moving further and further away. That's when we see bigger houses, bigger yards, more amenities, and kind of what is typically referred to as that white flight to the suburbs. Suburbanization in Davis County started in the 60s. We didn't see it to the south until later, but it really went north quickly. And that Bamberger rail line helped a lot, because not only did we have I-15, but we also had the Bamberger rail line that ran up through Orchard Boulevard and 400 East all the way up towards like Lagoon, where it terminated in Farmington. Then in 67, we have the Air Quality Act, which then we start seeing the environmental controls and some of those things. Fair Housing Act, banned redlining in 1968. But from the 30s to the 60s, you have that time period, and look at everything else that was happening during that same time period. So this really shows, then we get suburbanization in the west side of Salt Lake County. UTA begins service in 1970. Then we have the suburbanization in Utah County through the 80s. I-15's construction was finished in 1990, which then a few years later we started reconstructing it because that's what we do best. But then in 2010s, rapid population expansion to now we're getting suburban, exurban, the far north end of Davis County into Weber County, West Weber County. Cache Valley starts to boom. We start to see St. George explode. A lot of these areas that had been relatively stable for, 20, 30, 40, 50 years suddenly start seeing all these new developments come in because it's affordable. And then when we live further away, we become more reliant on the cars. But these areas that have been that staple of downtown still have needs that we haven't necessarily been addressing. So with that, I'll open it up. I know we don't have a ton of time, but I'm willing to stay longer to answer questions, have a bit of a discussion. I know a lot of you that are on the phone participated through the research project, and so you're well aware of everything that I've discussed today. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to address those now. I'll exit out of the PowerPoint so that we can see everyone's faces online. And away we go. Okay. Any questions? We'll go to Stacy first.
Okay, Shauna, excellent presentation. I really love the graphics at the end showing the timeline. I'm curious, just from your perspective, what do you hope this data will be used to do or to change, or what kind of progress do you hope it will help you make, or light will help shed on some of the conditions that we're experiencing here in Utah?
One of my things that I've kind of been stuck on, and I've talked to Eileen about this a number of times, I actually proposed, and I may propose as a follow-up for UTRAC this next year, doing some pilot projects where we actually identify some of these SVI tracts, and we can go in and look at what the conditions are and really do an inventory of not only what are the conditions, but what are the needs. Let's go talk to some of these populations and find out what their concerns are and what their needs really are. Do they want better transit access or more frequent transit service, or would they prefer better access to vehicles? Would a vehicle pilot project be useful in these areas? Really just getting a better idea. And, if there are infrastructure needs, what are those needs? We mentioned, some areas don't necessarily need the same things that we might say, oh, well, we need to improve XYZ, where the people there say, no, you don't. We'd rather have W. And so really, getting to know the people, getting to know what their needs are, would paratransit or specialized transit that helps them access medical appointments be more useful? What are we really seeing in these areas? I mean, we can do an overview and we can do the statistical analysis to kind of tease out some of those things, but what would be more beneficial? We see the schools going away. Would it be useful in these neighborhoods to work with the state school board to say, what if we just put in like a community collaborative school, where it's not a full-size elementary school, but maybe you could meet the needs of those local students without that big of an investment, or without having to bus them far away from their friends and their neighborhood. Another thing that we've talked about is when UDOT's doing projects, or when the local cities are doing projects, if a project is in or adjacent to one of these tracts that has been identified as vulnerable or high risk, maybe we do a little bit of extra research before we do that project to find out if we can add some extra amenities, or if there's some other add-on projects that we can do alongside it while we already are paying for the project, or doing some of these major improvements. Okay, there was another hand up.
I think it may have been Christopher.
Christopher, did you have a question or a comment?
No, I'm good. I was trying to work through in my mind how to even ask it, but this is really great. This is super. This is really helpful information. Kind of something I've been thinking about a lot lately. So, yeah, great analysis. Very helpful.
Thank you. It's tricky, right? Because like I said, context is everything. And so even if we have these, higher risk or vulnerable areas, just because they all meet those criteria doesn't necessarily mean that their needs are the same. And so if you're dealing with a community in North Ogden, that's not going to be the same as a community on the west side of Salt Lake City or in the south side of Provo or even, southeastern Utah. The needs aren't going to be the same. And so even though we have kind of these red flag criteria that we've identified, it's still important, like I mentioned to Stacy's question, to get in there and really get a greater understanding of what the population looks like and what their needs are. Christopher.
Let me try it this way. So when I was doing solely transit at one point in my life, we're having these conversations about low income areas and where to put the transit service. So I jumped in my car and went and drove through Poplar Grove and Glendale and that whole area. I was like, okay, let's see. I want to see how many of these people actually have cars at their house. So I drove through. I was like, 90% of the people have cars in their homes. And so I was like, well, okay, so then what's the issue? What are we trying to fix here? And how do you design a transit system to make that work? And the streets were narrow. And so you're bringing these big 40-foot long, 12-foot wide buses through these small, narrow streets, and there's safety issues with that. And people park on the roads. And so, yeah, I don't know that I had a good conclusion other than adding more frequency and service to the area, which is what we ended up doing, and adding Sunday service, which is what we ended up doing. But yeah, it was more complicated than just putting transit service out there. And I don't know that I have a good solution to it, but that was what we came up with at the time.
Yeah. Before I pass it back to Jared, to comment on that. Yes, many of those households have cars in the driveway, but how many people live in those households? So you may have a car, but what if you have 8 adults living in that house and there's one car? Or maybe that car doesn't even run well. Or maybe they can't afford to put gas in the car or, perform an oil change or do some of those things. General maintenance, has become so expensive, even if you have that extra income to be able to cover it. And so, I would argue that just because there's cars in the driveway doesn't necessarily mean that their mobility needs are being met, or that, there's not necessarily a car for every driver who may need one. Jared.
Yeah, Christopher, I appreciate you bringing that up. I actually used to work with the Sorensen Multicultural Center with Salt Lake County in the Glendale area. And just as Shauna mentioned, one of the biggest things that we found when we were looking and surveying the population was multi-generational households. And often those vehicles were purchased by their oldest child that was living in there and is solely used by that child or shared amongst 4 or 5 individuals, depending on their situation. So as we were looking at the community needs, that was something that we were considering and offering services and what we could do for the community. And so I think maybe tapping into some of our local resources, maybe rec centers, health departments, having that collaborative effort to get that better understanding might help us in that effort, looking at transit and active transportation.
Another thing that we did a research project looking at grade crossings. Jim will remember this project. And one of the major areas where we were having issues was over by West High School, where we would have students, jumping through slow moving trains to get across the tracks because they had to get to the high school. And the problem there was that you had, single parent homes or parents that got up and had to leave for work early. And so older siblings were responsible for making sure the younger siblings got to school and got out of the house. And so you'd see these high school kids that would have to walk, their younger elementary age siblings to school and get them there. And then they'd have to walk up to get to the high school. And so you'd see these kids, just like jumping through trains to get there in time so they didn't get a truancy or, so that they wouldn't be late for their classes because they were kind of that responsible party for the other kids in the household. And so, being able to provide that mobility, especially, if you're a single parent and you need the car to get yourself to work, then your teenagers don't have a car to shuttle their siblings around. And so then you're relying on bikes and kids walking. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about safe routes to school, is because we have to be able to provide a safe way for these kids to be able to walk to school. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer that kids should be able to walk safely to get to and from school, but it's been a difficult process, especially in a number of communities where they're just like, whatever. And parents won't send them if it's not like, if parents don't feel like it's safe for their kid, they're not going to let them walk unless it's a necessity. And then they'll have them walk whether it's safe or not. Do we have any other questions? If you have any questions after the fact, I'm always happy to answer anything or have a discussion offline. This has been a really great project to work on. I've learned a ton, and I'm hoping that as we move forward that I'll be able to help UDOT out additionally in the future, just because I feel so invested in the topic and really want to see some good things happen. But I do, again, I just have to say how much I appreciate the work of everyone on the TAC for their contributions, because this really was an all-in project where everyone helped out and provided contributions in a meaningful way. And that doesn't always happen in research, but in this case, it really did, which is a testament to how important the topic is.
Thank you, Shauna. We all appreciate the work you've done here. If anybody needs a copy of the link for the published report, let me know, because I recognize that that while it is published on our research main page, sometimes it can be tricky to find. And again, just a reminder, anybody that wants professional development credit for this hour, just let me know and we'll get you a certificate. Again, thanks to everybody who attended and your questions and your insights, and we thank you for participating.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shauna. Well done.